Hey, Lake Valley, we're closing in on the end of home group time, taking a break in July. Hopefully you are. It's good to take a break. And so we're going to finish up the month of June with the I am statements from the Gospel of John. Just give you a quick update on Drew, since if you didn't know, Drew had some blockage in his heart on Friday. This would have been June 1st, and goes in for an EKG, has 2 stents put in immediately, had to wait through the weekend, then on June 4th got a 3rd stent put in, and he's doing great. He's at home resting, so thank you for your prayers. And because of that, the notes are a little bit confusing because Drew wasn't able to preach the sermon that he was ready to preach, so I stepped up and preached the sermon, the text, obviously very different than where Drew was going because I can't read his mind. I know we're like tight, we're like in there, but not that much. So I preached the sermon on the 2 I am statements that Jesus says, I am the gate, and he also says that I am the good shepherd. This is all in John 10, and the context is really important. As I said in my sermon, chapter 9 is a story. It's one of the messianic miracles of healing the blind man. But the blind man is also symbolic of the leadership of Israel. And Jesus starts off saying, I am the gate, that you need to come through the gate, not over the wall, because a thief or a robber, a wolf would come over the wall or over the fence. I open the gate, and that's where my sheep are. And so he gives us this picture of a night watchman who's watching the sheep in a fence. And he says, I open the gate, and you must come through the gate. In other words, you must come through me. Any other access is from the evil one. He is using this context, or the context that he's in is the same audience in chapter 9. So he's referring to the shepherds of Israel who have not been good shepherds. They have led the sheep of Israel astray. And so the point is very clear. And Jesus says, I am the door, I am the gate. You must come through me. And so be a good discussion about that. This idea of Jesus being the door, the only door, the gate, that we must access in order to see his way and to know his truth. And we can ask the question about our shepherds. Do our shepherds, are they good shepherds? I think Drew was going in this direction with some of these questions about leadership. The idea that we could be led astray by a false shepherd. That not all shepherds are good. Not all pastors are good. Not all church leaders or leadership are good leadership. And what would be the indicator that they're not good? That they're not leading you to Christ, to the door, to the gate. If we're not pointing you to Christ, then you need to question our leadership. If we're not willing to be sheep, you need to question our leadership, because we're sheep too as shepherds. We're still a part of the sheepfold. And Jesus is the good shepherd. And so it's got to be through his gate, through him, that people are leading you. And so we ask that question about leadership, and we could also say Jesus models for us in this text what a shepherd does. And one of the things he says is a shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So a great question to ask about your spiritual shepherds, your spiritual leadership in your life. Are they laying down their life for you? Are they pointing you to Christ, to the gate, to the only way? Those are great questions to be asking. We also talk about how, I talked in my sermon, how that sheep have 4 characteristics and a shepherd has 4 characteristics. And some of the things we said about sheep is that they get lost, that they're stubborn, that they need discipline. And so talk about that in your group. What are the ways that sheep get lost? How do we get lost spiritually? And because Isaiah 53 says all of us like sheep have gone astray. So we are like sheep, and sheep wander off. Sheep follow their fleshly needs rather than direction or guidance. They are defenseless, as I said in my sermon. They don't have any defense mechanisms. They don't have horns or wings, or they're not fast. They can't change color. There are a lot of things that we see among the animal kingdom, sheep don't have. And so we need a shepherd to guide us. We need a shepherd to protect us. We need a shepherd to lead us. And so we contrasted this with Psalm 23 that talks about how the shepherd provides. So read Psalm 23 out loud and ask yourself these questions. How does God provide rest for us? How does he provide protection? Because Psalm 23 says God is a shepherd. It says the Lord is my shepherd. How does he provide for our needs? How does he discipline us? Great question to ask. Talked about this a little bit in my sermon. What's the difference between discipline and bad things happening? Not all bad things that happen are discipline. How do you know the difference? What does the discipline of the Lord look like? And we talked about how that a shepherd will discipline the sheep. He'll leave the 99 and go after the one, and he'll bring him back, and he has a way of disciplining that sheep to help him remember who the shepherd is, to hear his voice so that he knows and he won't wander off. What are the ways spiritually that you find rest, protection, God meeting your needs, and discipline? That's how the shepherd takes care of us spiritually. The next sermon, we talk about Jesus says, I am the resurrection. So here's where we've covered to this point. We've talked about Jesus as the bread of life. I am the bread of life. We've talked about Jesus, I am the light of the world. We've talked about Jesus, I am the good shepherd. And we've talked about, I am the gate. This Sunday, we're talking about Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life. In this sermon, it's based in a story of the raising of Lazarus. And again, this is a messianic miracle, basically pointing to Jesus being the Messiah because he is raising the dead. Now, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, which is important because you really weren't considered dead until you've been in the grave for 3. There's a kind of a folklore or ancient thing that your spirit hung around for 3 days. And so after the 3rd day, that spirit was gone. Not a biblical idea, just more of a folk cultural idea. Would have also been true in that day. So Jesus waits. We see him in this story. You know, if you read the story, the people are freaking out. And Jesus is hanging out. He's not in any hurry. And so that creates something in the people in the story. We see 3 main characters. We see Thomas, we see Martha, and we see Mary. And I point to these 3 and how their faith is dying within them, and Jesus wants to resurrect that faith. So it's not just a physical resurrection, it is a spiritual resurrection. So first we see doubting Thomas. Thomas is very sarcastic in the story and says, well, let's just go die with Lazarus. Again, you see his sarcasm and his doubt. What kind of doubts do you have? Our faith dies when we have doubts that God can do what only he can do. That God, through other people, can do what they couldn't do on their own. So talk about some of your doubts and how they have defeated your faith. Second thing we see is discouragement. Martha is discouraged because Jesus didn't come. And he wasn't there when they needed him. And she was discouraged. How does discouragement hurt your faith in your life? Things aren't working out like you wanted them to. Maybe you had expectations for something or someone. And how does that discouragement defeat your faith? Well, Martha says something in this story where she says her faith moves from discouragement to some hope. And she says, even now, I know that you can take care of my brother Lazarus. Even now. So we see some courage there in Martha, and she believes. Now, she doesn't understand exactly what Jesus is going to do or what he can do, but she knows he can do something. And sometimes that's just enough. Sometimes our faith just needs to hang on to one little thread, one piece of God doing something. And so that leads us to the third, and we see the delay. Her faith is down and defeated because of the delay. How many of you struggle with God's timing? How many of us struggle with the timing of what God is going to do, what we've prayed for, what we've asked for, and yet it never seems to happen? God's timing is not as our time. And you can see this in this story. They're freaking out. Jesus is hanging out. He's not in a hurry because his purpose and his plans are perfect. And he waited till the fourth day to raise Lazarus from the dead for a reason. And so you see Mary in her delay in her faith that's dying because of that. So how have you struggled with doubt, discouragement, and delay in your own faith? We say in the sermon that God's delays are not his denial. Sometimes we can become very sarcastic or negative or fatalistic because we just don't think it's going to happen. And maybe it's not going to happen. But that's up to God, and we have to trust God with it. And even trusting God with it not happening, I love the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're going in the furnace, and they know God's going to rescue them, but their faith says, even if you don't, we're going to continue to worship you. And that's kind of what Martha was saying too. Even though you might not do it how I want or when I want, I know you're going to do so. I know you can, and I know you have a purpose greater than this. So God's delays are not his denials. The next thing we talk about is this: Jesus makes the claim that I am the resurrection and the life. A good distinction we want to make is God raises Lazarus from the dead. It is a sign, it's one of the signs, it's a messianic sign saying he's the Messiah. But John is also pointing to a future resurrection that's going to be the Son of God after 3 days and raising from the dead, having victory over sin. And so this is a foreshadow of that resurrection. But Jesus says, I am the resurrection. So resurrection is not just something he does for Lazarus. It's not just something he does in our dead faith. It is who he is. He is the resurrection. How is that different? How is that important? Because he can bring dead things to life. When Jesus comes in, dead things don't stay dead. How does it make a difference if Jesus says, I am? That's who I am. That's what I do. That's who I am. How does that affect your life? And how is that important for your faith? Jesus is all about resurrecting things, not just dead bodies, but things in your life that you think are dead. Children, marriages, friends, a job, safety, security, all those things Jesus can resurrect because of who he is, not just what he does. Hope you have a great discussion. We love you guys. Have a great summer. Get out on the lake. Have some lemonade. Thanks for praying for Drew. We'll have him back here soon. Bye.